Andrew, thank you so much for coming on to COLLAF Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sort of happy to just dive straight in.
Absolutely.
So how did you initially get involved in the art world?
Yeah, I don't know. It was not. I'd always been interested in art. I actually went to school and wanted to study art, but they didn't think it was something you could make a career out of. So I missed out on that element of study. And actually, I just started writing about art when I was much later on, when I was doing my postgraduate work. I was doing a PhD in literature and philosophy, and I started to write reviews on the side, and then it kind of grew from there. And then one person asked me to make a show, and then we didn't even call ourselves curators in those days because it wasn't a fashionable term, and I just did it. So I always kind of feel that I might be a little bit faking it, but I've been doing it long enough now that I think I can get away with it.
When I first sort of stepped into the art world, I really felt like I had to fake it in a way, and sort of you have to act like you know what you're talking about in a room full of people who some do, some don't.
Everyone has different bits of knowledge, and I do find that in the art world there's a very steep learning curve that you you sort of get immersed and you never leave, and that's also the other thing. And I'm interested in it in another way, because in terms of that learning curve, because what I do and others do, when we teach and we think about contemporary art as a subject to learn, it's interesting because, of course, it always has to be kind of regenerating and evolving, and the change in terms of the actual subject matter of what we talk about. And I think that's what's fascinating, you know. And even if you were sort of talking in terms of art history, that will be relatively stable compared to thinking about curatorial ideas and contemporary practice, which is always sort of pushing at the edge of things.
When you, as a curator, when you're putting on a show, do you first focus on the art that you want to use, or the storyline and the theme?
It's a great question, and it's one that I kind of think a lot about with my students, because you can sort of come with a thematic, and then what you've got to try and do is find a whole bunch of stuff that fits that theme. The problem with that is that then your viewer goes around almost with a checklist and sort of ticking boxes. Oh yeah, I see how that fits. I see how that fits. And as interesting and helpful as that can be, it might not be intuitively the most interesting show to see. And there's another way, which is almost the opposite thing of that, which is like, how do I make sense of that work of art? Where does it come from? Where does it belong? How does it fit? What's it trying to do? And then you build something around it. There are other criteria, like, you know, well, where are you doing something? You know, if you're doing a biennial, for example, you're going to be asking questions about where you are. Why would you want to do a show like this in a place like this? Or if you're doing something kind of more monographic, maybe a retrospective of someone, and say, well, why would we do this right now? And what's the particular story that you're going to do? So that your question, the answer to your question is yes, basically all of the above, you know, that actually there isn't really a fixed way of doing it. I think of curating, I think of making exhibitions as a kind of research. So you research to do the exhibition, but the research itself, the exhibition itself is a kind of research, because it's testing out how this work works. You're putting it out there, you're making it visible, you're showing it, and you're gauging reactions and so on. So it's a form of
It's a form of education.
It's a form of education, and it's a form of continuous process. So when you do the show isn't the beginning and the end of something. It's another way of seeing, and it's a way of opening something up to your viewer.
Are there certain criteria when you're curating a show? You say, we absolutely must have this. Things like diversity, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it gets more layered, I think, over the years. I always used to be very concerned, let's say, if you did a group show and you didn't have an equal balance between men and women, and if you go back only 20 years, you'd see these massive monographic shows, or these big surveys, and there'd be like no women or one woman, or and you just think, hang on, how could you tell the story in that way? It's not being, I mean, it's so obvious, and yet time and time again, books are written that way, whole movements are defined that way, and so on. So that was, but in a sense, that's kind of a straightforward one. But then you also have to understand sensitivities of other kind of forms of identification or self-identification, whether it's through gender or race or beliefs or whatever that is. And I have a working principle, which is that it has to be drawn from the artist. I think the only thing that one needs to be aware of is that those sensitivities and issues are constantly evolving. So you need to be thinking about that, and it doesn't. There's no handbook for that.
Yeah.
There's kind of basic sort of ethical behavior that you kind of know that you can't, but equally there's other stuff that that evolves, perhaps even during the exhibition itself, that you learn something in that process.
And with the rise of sort of digital art platforms, how does that affect the future of curation?
It's a really interesting question, and it's a really interesting area. I'm old enough and old-fashioned enough in a way to think that our relationship to art, and my relationship to art as a curator, was always about a direct encounter, going to see the work, being with it, actually having a physical relationship to it. And then over the years, I've kind of started to see that it would be kind of naive to only operate in that way when you have digital access the way that we increasingly do. I guess my eyes really opened, and my kind of conversion was complete during lockdown, and during those years where we couldn't really curate in a traditional way.
Yes.
And a few things happened that I kind of thought that were really interesting to me. One or two museums, for example, started to make works available online for you to sort of explore them and study them. And what was fascinating about this was that they gave you a kind of access through the digital realm and through the resolution of the images that were there and available that you couldn't have had even if you'd been there. And I remember being kind of really sort of taken aback by that, thinking, okay, that's a revolution, because if I can start to look at details at one of those kind of extraordinary paintings that you think that you've known all your life, etc., if I can start to see other things
that I couldn't in real life,
that you couldn't in real life because you couldn't get near enough. You literally couldn't get near enough. So that already is a game changer. But something else happened to me during lockdown, where someone in a gallery in Germany asked me to curate a series of shows. So I did 4 shows in a row over, I think, a year. And what they'd done is that they'd scanned their conventional spaces and said, okay, what would you do if you could come here, if you could do the show, etc. And I realized that actually I was going to do shows that I wouldn't have done, because if they'd have invited me in a conventional way, they probably would have invited me to do a group show, so I probably would have only done one show. But instead, I did 4 solo shows that were kind of impossible shows, but absolutely shows that we could have done, were we able to. And indeed, actually, there's even talk about us kind of reconstructing one of them, and and so on. And it was a revelation, because there was all the stuff that I had been worried about that got lost in the digital process was actually there. So the dialogue with artists, the relationship to space with artists, the relationship to context, why we're doing it here now, again, all of those kinds of questions. And in fact, it was incredibly satisfying. It was actually one of the best experiences. And interestingly enough, each one of those projects has had spin-offs. And so I was persuaded out of necessity. I mean, those are strange times, and one would desperately hope you wouldn't go back to them. But having had to learn about how to operate in those restrictions, there's no going back. Now we do that. Now we operate online. I also saw it, by the way, with my students, who were almost paralyzed by lockdown, because by definition they are out making exhibitions, or the art students who are by definition in the studio. And it took us a few months to figure out ways that they could be in the studio, with the appropriate social distancing. But the curating students were really interesting, because they were saying, well, okay, well, if we can't curate in the world, where are we going to curate? And so, of course, the immediate answer is online, but which spaces online, etc. And so I remember one morning going into one of those forever Zooms, that we did in those days, with a sort of heavy heart. And there was this curating student who had made a show inside Minecraft, inside the program, because it was a space that was available and accessible and usable, and you could participate, and it was shareable. And I just thought, this is kind of great, because
it's interesting because of what you said before about how space can have such an effect on a show.
Yeah.
And how you curate a show.
Yeah.
And obviously, when you're looking at a screen, you think it's the same thing. But once you go into something deeper, for example, like creating a show on Minecraft, you can actually make them completely different.
You can create new contexts,
worlds that you couldn't see in real life.
Absolutely. This is now fully embedded in the way that we have to think about art. But never lose sight of, and I really feel strongly about this, that we should never lose sight of we are in the business, whether we are involved in buying and selling art, whether we're involved in curating, whether we're just an audience, whether we're an artist. There's one thing that's fundamental. Me looking at a work of art, and the work of art looking back at me, and that's a physical embodied experience. The digital can help you get there, but that thing, that's everything,
and it's irreplaceable. You can't replicate. It's irreplaceable. You can't replicate.
It's irreplaceable. It's irreplaceable. And you, as a viewer, you have to imagine that where you are standing is where the artist once stood when they painted the painting. Like imagine that.
I never thought of it like that.
But think about it. Going to a museum is like time travel. You stand in front of a painting, you're standing pretty much as close to the painting as where the artist was. And you are, it's literally, you're there. And where the artist, when Rembrandt painted a self-portrait, he was there, and I'm just about to get into the same place. That's mind-blowing. Yeah. And that's the clue. That's the secret. That's the key to understanding any work of art. Because as difficult as contemporary art is, and it's difficult because contemporary art is so many things at once, as difficult as art is, it will always reveal itself if you spend enough time looking.
You obviously do an enormous amount of things, teaching, advising, curating, obviously. What would you say is your favourite?
I kind of think that they're all kind of one thing.
Okay.
And I think that they feed each other and they feed off each other. I'll explain a little bit what I think about that. Obviously, when you're teaching, and I mean that's self-explanatory in terms of trying to understand how art is and so on. We talk about context all the time. We talk about how a work of art fits, where it belongs, what's the line of history that it connects to. And as a curator, when you're working institutionally, of course, it's absolutely kind of thrilling that you're able to sort of develop ideas into a practical reality. Well, advising is another layer on top of all of that. In a way, it's almost a kind of gathering together of all of that. It's all the knowledge and all of those things combined. And then there's the physicality. Because when you're advising, you aren't just saying, let's have that one and not dealing with it. When you say that's that for that one, you're taking responsibility for a work of art and where it goes and what it does and what you're going to do with it. And it's exactly the same. I've advised the government art collection and I advise individuals. I've advised institutions and foundations, and I've advised individuals who want to develop their own collection. It's the same all the way through. You have a set of criteria and set of responsibilities, and the exciting thing is the handling. That a work of art is not just a concept, it's not just an image, it's a thing, and you have responsibility for it. So I'm less interested in brokering deals than I am in creating collections, because collections start to become a narrative in themselves.
Stories, yeah.
I mean, they tell a story, and if they're great collections, they don't tell a story of me as an advisor, they tell a story of the collector.
In the classic nature versus nurture question, how much does a university nurture a great artist?
I have to say I'm a great obsessive believer in art school and the universities that contain them. I've taught for as long as I've been thinking about art, and there are times when the institution kind of is so overwhelming and it gets you down. You just say, why would I do this? It's underpaid, overworked, all of that. But there's a reason why. There's something extraordinary that happens in an art school that I never really understood until I saw it in action, which is this kind of enabling of ideas and this becoming articulate. But very importantly, there are different ways that this happens. So in terms of nature versus nurture, nurturing is really important. But your obligation maybe, because I don't paint, so I'm not going to teach someone how to paint, but I am going to teach them how to think and become articulate about what they do. And that's really important. And you can't take for granted, and this is a very crucial thing in terms of the teaching process for an artist, a young artist, you can't take for granted that the teacher knows more than the student. This is something that one of the great teachers, I always kind of hang on to, the best art school teachers ever, Michael Craig Martin, taught me. He said there's two ways of teaching. One, you can teach people to be like yourself, but not quite as good. Okay? And for obvious reasons, you really do not want you
want the student to become the master.
Exactly. You want them still to be worshipping at your feet. And that's really the way that a lot of art schools taught. There was that kind of atelier system where you had a group of students and they were learning at the feet of the master, and there were they sort of inched forward, but it was very much of that school. And those schools still exist, and there's a lot of stature that comes with it, depending on who you study with. But there's a second way, And the second way, which seemed to me always like a revelation, and and he said this to me like 30 something years ago, and I was like, oh. The second way is this: you can teach. You can teach what you want to teach with them, but actually there are things that a young artist knows that you don't. And you might say, oh yeah, but what do they know? I've seen everything. I've been around. I've seen, and actually think about what we define as cool. Cool is not something that an old bloke can impose. It's cool is something that kind of emerges intuitively amongst kind of younger people. And if you imagine that in terms of artists and so on, their intuition is something you're trying to capture. But if you try to capture their intuition and corral it into a shape that isn't natural, then you're distorting that and you're kind of ruining all the magic. So the thing that you would want to hope to achieve is maximize on that intuition and help them be able to articulate why they are making those decisions, why they're looking at this, why they're changing their mind in relation to one thing or another. So you're really teaching them to prioritize the things that they already are looking at, but just giving them the tools with which to analyze that. And once you have those tools, then you can be able to develop work in a more way. So nature, nurture, in a funny kind of way, well, both at the same time. But with this thing, that if you were teaching them, maybe the biggest job would be to try and step back and watch them and sort of help them develop the way they naturally would have done it. And maybe you help them speed up, and maybe you help them just be able to understand why they're doing it.
No, it's a really good point, because often when I've gone to shows and they either have the curator there or the artist there explaining the show, first you get so much more out of it than going without that. But it makes such a difference when an artist is really passionate about the subject they've created and why they've made it, rather than sort of saying, oh, I had this idea of this color and played around with it. It's a lot more meaningful when they're able to articulate what really went through their mind when creating the work.
Absolutely. But the interesting thing is with artists, it sometimes takes them a long time. They may be making amazing work, but they might not know why it's amazing. And it just may take time. It may take even years. And it's interesting. I've seen artists who sort of grow up in that process of making art. And then you do look back to their early work and you just think, oh, it was fantastic. But I'm not sure that they knew why.
Do you think the story behind an artwork and the way an artist articulates it actually increases the value of the work?
Well, it helps. It's interesting. You talk about pure value. I mean, like in financial value. If you look at the way that art is sold, it's always sold with stories. If you look at auction catalogs as a perfect example, they're always giving you a story around a work of art, because in a way, for all of us, that's our way in.
As a professor, given that art is so subjective, how do you grade it?
Okay, this is the best question. It's the best question. If anyone ever has doubts about what we do and why art,
I don't doubt it.
No. But it's the best question about that process of learning. Okay, so you go to a degree show and you look around, and so what you are seeing there is, let's say, a postgraduate degree show, whatever. Let's say you're seeing 50, 100 artists working in dramatically different ways, and you just wonder how the assessment was being made. The thing that is uncanny, it's spookily uncanny, is that when those things are being assessed, you've got a group of people who are assessing, and they go around and they do their assessment. Let's say there's half a dozen people assessing a degree show. What is spooky is just how consistent it is when they come back and compare their marks. I can never get over it. Every now and then you get like a big argument. And it's very often an argument which is a very ideological one. And so people will be taking very strong positions. But for the most part, it's remarkable how consistent that process of assessment is. And I've thought about why that is the case. And I suspect that it's not about who is the best artist, but it's more about who has achieved what they set out to achieve in their work, and how successful were they in that process. And that's visible and that's quantifiable. And so I mean, I'm so pleased you asked that question, because it's something I never get over. You know, I mean, there are moments where it's kind of awkward, but statistically, they're so small, and very often there's a reason why. But for the most part, it's absolutely remarkable. I've done other things where I've been an external examiner, which is a very strange process. So you imagine that process has already been done. And so there's like 6 people that have all agreed their marks. They've been averaged out and it's all been agreed. And then they get sent to me and I have to look and check that they've all reached whatever. And even at that stage, even at a different university, even with artists that I've never seen before, you go, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. And so it's not, and I'm not saying that there's a special, I think there's just a kind of training in terms of an open perspective on what you're seeing. So of course that is different from other kinds of subjects that one learns at university.
There's a more clear right and wrong.
Where there's a more clear right and wrong. But equally, you know, universities. And the reason why we love universities, although they're under pressure in this regard, the reason why we love university is because they're places of research where, in theory, we're going to see something come into the world that has not existed before.
Yes.
So our criteria for judgment are going to be tested. And so our criteria are going to have to be, whether it's in science or whether it's in the arts, so our criteria are going to have to come with an open mind, but just with a lot of experience and dexterity to understand, is this communicating the way it's set out to communicate? And if it does, then that's a huge part of it. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's also that extra little sparkle bit which we all get excited about, but that's something else.
It's interesting what you said about the similar marking, because obviously this wasn't a grading system, but at my former job I used to run art prizes with brands.
Yeah.
So how it would work was we had artists who would send in their works with explanations of the works they put in, and they would align with a certain theme that it was around. So whether it was about oceans or the earth, whatever it was, we would then send them to judges to judge.
Yeah.
And let's say there were 30 and we got to pick a top 3.
Yeah.
The shortlisted 6 were pretty much the same from all the collectors. They would choose the same artist without knowing, obviously. I just rethought about it, how similar their thought process towards the motivation behind the work they've done.
Absolutely. Now, there is one danger with it. And it's a danger that I think emerges in an art world that is 100 times bigger than it was 20 years ago. And that is that, and again through social media and through a kind of digital distribution of images, that there are images, and I distinguish images from works of art. There are images that thrive in a digital realm, and there are images that work or the works of art that work really well, let's say in an art fair. If you're walking down one of those interminable corridors, the work of art that catches your eye probably catches the eye of all the other people as well. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, you go and do a survey at the end of Frieze and whatever, and see the most Instagrammed pieces, and it's very consistent.
Yes.
And so the danger is that artists sort of try to anticipate that and try to make a kind of art that responds to that or tries to get sort of involved with that. And I do think in a sort of social media age, I think art has changed, or certainly the art that we're looking at has changed. Those little quiet works of art, there's not much space for them. We're looking for a certain thing. I mean, you know, I've got this theory, and I'd love to get a PhD student to do the work for me, which is that at the beginning of Instagram, when it was just square, I'm convinced that there was a growth in square paintings, that people were kind of starting to make paintings that kind of fitted.
I'm sure that fit it.
You know, but think about the colors, think about the way that people are kind of drawn in and so on. So the danger of a kind of shared affinity is that sometimes it's to do with things that are kind of potentially kind of superficials. But that's a kind of art world phenomenon, because what we're finding is that the art that does really, really well very, very quickly financially is very often something that is very strong visually, very reproducible. Mm-hmm. And that reproducibility is what is the key way that the interest gets disseminated and so on. I mean, it was ever thus, even pre-digitally, you know, distribution was always what it was about. It was always about getting the work of art out there into the world. Recognizability, branding, etc., was always kind of central. Mm-hmm. You know, that's why Picasso was Picasso. And so, you know, and the reproducible images and artists are the ones that really kind of power through the market.
Yeah. You served on the jury for the Turner Prize.
Yeah.
How did that experience influence your perspective on contemporary art and its recognition?
That's interesting. First of all, the experience of doing the Turner Prize is both amazing and really stressful, and I'll explain why. I mean, why it's amazing, of course, is it makes you work really hard. Mm-hmm. It makes you go and see 200 shows. You know, it really makes you do your homework. And you feel during that year, it's not about who wins, it's about that process leading up to it. And that was great. I mean, in terms of that kind of a energetic self-education, that was phenomenal. The interesting thing about the Turner Prize that makes it quite stressful if you're a judge is that there is the reason why the Turner Prize exists is that it was created to try and broaden the appeal of contemporary art to a public in anticipation of things like Tate Modern and so on. That as we weren't a country that did a lot of that visited a lot of contemporary art, and actually that process of education has been enormous since the origin of the Turner Prize, and you absolutely have to credit Tate for kind of capturing the public imagination. Mm-hmm. Now, the plus side and the minus side of that is that when you capture the public imagination, everyone wants to talk about it. The minus side is that everyone thinks they've got an opinion on it, and you're caught in the middle of that. So during that year of the Turner Prize, I remember so many taxi conversations with the cabbies, and yeah, what about that? You know, and because they all feel they have something too often to say. Equally, there was and remains still a kind of resistance to the contemporary, and very often you'll see it played out in the national press. So, for example, in my year of the Turner Prize, there was one of the newspapers actually sought a freedom of information request to get the judges' correspondence to try to understand how we reached the decisions that we did and whatever, because there's an implication and there was a sort of concern that, you know, the art world just cooks it up for itself, you know, and that we're just sort of doing favors for each other kind of thing. And honestly, nothing could have been further from the truth during my year, and it was absolutely fascinating. We did not agree with each other. We had very strong, heated discussions in the room. Really, and so the process was. You only get to do it once, and I'm kind of glad, because I don't think I'd want to do it again. But I'm so glad I did it.
For sure.
I think so. It can be hard, but it also relates to something we haven't talked about very much, which is a sort of collaborative practice. And in the art world, I kind of think that that's something very interesting. Co-curating, co-selecting, choosing a prize winner in a group, sitting on a board or a committee, where you're making decisions together, and you are accommodating things that might not fit your aesthetic, that might not fit your ethic, might not fit your beliefs, etc. But how do you accommodate those things without compromise?
Yes.
So I'm not saying compromise, but I am saying you do have to keep yourself open to things. Also, because I found that over time, you look at things, we all look at stuff, and you go, no, not for me. And then slowly you start to understand it, and it becomes more interesting for you. And I would say that single-handedly, I guess less so now, but it's still in the conversation, but single-handedly, the Turner Prize educated this country about contemporary art.
Yeah.
It made them have to think about new stuff before that new stuff really found its place in the museum. Because by the time we get to see things that are in the museum, they're kind of done and dusted, that history's sort of got them in there. But the Turner Prize was kind of more alive than that. And because it had so much public interest, even people who didn't go and see the show felt they had an awareness of it.
I also think it's interesting because the Turner Prize, I have friends who went to see the Turner Prize who aren't interested in art at all. It's the idea of judgment.
Yeah.
And I think naturally human nature, fortunately or unfortunately, we like to judge.
Look, absolutely.
So people like to go make their own opinion.
And they'll make their opinion and say, okay, I'm going to back that horse.
Exactly.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I mean, I love that. I mean, that's so great.
What do you think of the rise of mega galleries and commercial art fairs? Do you think they're beneficial, or actually it's killing the traditional gallery model, and it's actually at cost for emerging artists?
Yeah. Well, there's many things to talk about. I am sort of grateful that those mega galleries exist, and I'll tell you why. With some caveats, but the reason why I'm grateful they exist is that they have resources that even our institutions could only dream of. And again, I tell my students, I said, go and see that show at Gagosian. Calling it museum quality is an understatement. The museum dreams of doing that show.
Yes.
And be a pain. Go and ask. If you need information, go and ask on the desk. They have it behind the desk. Go and get it. It's there. It's available, and they need to give it to you. And so I feel very strongly that they operate in two ways. They operate, of course, like this kind of mega commercial billion-dollar entities, but equally they operate as a kind of institution in themselves, and they are doing that. And they're working with estates, they're working with legacies, they're working with the history of those artists, they're working with documentation, with contextualization in terms of exhibition, they're working with publication, etc. And they're working every bit as thoroughly as a museum might. Now, that's part one. Part two is as there come to be really only a handful of these mega galleries, you ask what's the space for the smaller galleries or even the mid-sized galleries. And I think that there's a couple of thoughts. The optimistic reading is that these big guys are making markets, and they're making people step up and understand that this is a market, and they're creating a market that actually didn't exist. There was a time when there really was really fraction of the collectors that there are.
Yes.
Whatever. So there's that. At the same time, and the problem is that if you know, there's an accusation that those big galleries are somehow taking all of the money of the collectors or whatever. I think that the bigger those galleries get, I think that there is still that they will only get bigger if the market gets bigger. If the market gets bigger, then there is space for other galleries to operate.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that they're going to have to operate in a different way. And you know, part of the challenge, for example, is that you look to the younger galleries or the smaller galleries for the younger artists, for the artists that are going to be the big ones or whatever. And then when that artist becomes hot, there is a narrative that that artist then gets stolen by one of the mega galleries. Now, the smart big galleries are now learning that there's an advantage of sharing and collaborating, and that there's something that the smaller galleries can do that the bigger galleries can't. The big gallery is like a big it's like a big boat on the ocean. It takes a long time for it to turn, you know? Whereas the smaller gallery, in theory, should be more agile and should be more able to and receptive to look at what's going on and pick it all up. The challenge is, though, is that, you know, it's very expensive to run a gallery. And so you've got this overhead that you're just kind of trying to navigate. And so you know, it can be make or break whether you keep that artist that you have made in the first place. So my instinct is that, you know, it can be very unfair, but the smart ones are kind of recognizing that the ecosystem needs large galleries, middle galleries, and small galleries. And artists are smart, you know. And I think one should take the cue from artists who recognize the advantages of being part of different communities within the art world, and it's, on the one hand, it's kind of strategic, but on the other hand, it kind of just knows that, you know, this gallery is where I might be going for a particular way of thinking about my art, for a particular dialogue, etc. So you do see artists who are really understanding that it's actually for them to navigate whether they want to be part of that big entity and the advantages and disadvantages of that. Because think about it, you know, it may be a dream come true on the one level, but to be a small fish in a big, you know, etc.
Of course. For example, when you go to the art fairs, you kind of already have a clue of who Gagosian's going to show, who Hauser and Wirth are going to show, because they're going to show their biggest name artists. So even if they have taken on someone who's becoming more established but is emerging, they're not going to be on show at the show.
No.
At Frieze or Art Basel, etc.
No, and that's the other thing, which is, you know, there's a lot at stake.
Are there any art trends that you think at the moment are overhyped or underappreciated?
I mean, the biggest thing I think that has evolved in the past decade sort of brings us all the way back to the beginning in a way, is around identity. The history that we were always taught was white, European, male, and that was really a kind of thing, a dominant narrative that went through everything. It went for 1,000 years, it was that. What's changed is that we are looking further afield, that we're trying to understand different ways of making art in different cultural contexts. The challenge of that, of course, is that if that is the trend, then you just got scouts going out into far-flung places and sort of trying to bring them back into the same system that existed before. But I think that is the strongest thing. Self-identity would be the kind of the strongest. It's not a trend. I mean, it's just the strongest driver in the new art world today. It exposes us to new ways of producing art that we didn't know about. So yeah, everything's international, everything's digital, everything's accessible 24 hours a day. And yet, what you and I know is that the art world sort of takes us out of our comfort zone, and that's a really important part of it. So if there's something that's really, really dominating now, I think it's that. How do artists identify in terms of where they're from, in terms of who they are, and that becomes visible and becomes part of the practice.
If someone were to start acquiring today, what advice would you give them, and where would you tell them to find those sort of hidden gems?
So the biggest fear that every collector that I've ever worked with has when they start is they always say, oh, but I'm too late. So-and-so started 20 years ago and they've got that or that. It's never too late, and that you have to hold strong, because whatever is going on today, half of it will be interesting in 10 years' time, half of it won't be, but that's okay. That's really okay. So that's the first thing to carry with you moving forward. It's not too late. Very important. That's a mantra, In terms of where you go, I also have a kind of principle whenever I work with someone is that we spend 6 months not buying anything.
Wow.
So we go.
It's tough. If someone thinks they're already too late, you've got another 6 months to go.
It doesn't always work, but the principle is 6 months with a wish list, with what would we buy if we buy, etc., etc. So there's a kind of process to understand where your priorities are, etc. Because the hardest work of art to buy is probably the first, maybe the second work of art. It gets easier with the third work of art. The third work of art is easy to buy because you buy it in relation to the second work and the first work. The first work obviously is hard because, like, what's going to be my statement? Everyone's going to always ask me, what was the first work of art you bought? The second work of art is harder because because now the stakes are high. I'm a collector, etc. The third work of art, it's already starting to look like a little room, and so on. So it gets easier as you go along. Where would you go? Okay, so think about this, and this is an interesting thing. Everybody is looking for that little corner that no one else has discovered, that they're going to be able to buy something really great for a couple of £1,000, and it's going to be worth a couple of million in 10 years' time. So there's an interesting kind of conundrum there. Now, you can have that, and I have bought works for artists, for collectors, that are worth 100, sometimes multiple hundreds of what they paid, and that was lucky. I could say I'm a genius. I'm not. It was lucky. But that never really happens at the very early start of collecting. So there's two ways of buying. You could buy 100 works of art this year at starter prices, and statistically 9 out of 10 might not still be in the conversation in 10 years' time. So that approach would work because actually maybe 10% or even 5% would still be kind of interesting, and they will pay for all of the debris that gets left behind. But equally, you can be a little bit more careful and buy into an artist once they've been through that kind of first round of discovery, and it's then more expensive, but less hit and miss.
Less risk.
Less risk.
Yeah.
Or you do a combination of the two, which is sort of what you end up wanting to do. Or there's a third view, which is just go blue chip. And, but so in terms of where you're discovering, I mean, the main thing, and this is whether you're a collector, whether you're a curator, whether you're a writer, if you are involved in art, you have to go and look at art. Sounds so obvious, but actually, and that does not mean getting the JPEGs from the gallery. It means going out and doing that. So that's got to be a weekly ritual. If it's, if you're not devoting at least one day a week to doing that, you're not doing a job. And you just got to be looking and looking and looking and looking, and then by the extension, then traveling, etc., etc. So there's a kind of process of knowledge that starts to make sense, and that in that process of mapping out where this art comes, that is how you start to discover what you should be buying, whatever. Because everyone sort of says to me all the time, "Oh, can I come to your degree show? Who should I be buying as the next thing?" And the interesting thing is that we sort of have an idea, because there's a degree of professional practice with the students where that they're already doing stuff, etc., etc. Because I've always been strictly hands off about it, and I also don't like that pressure that they have, and also, it's not so cheap to buy from a degree show anymore. It used to be, but now people are almost pricing ahead of themselves.
Yeah.
And also, that's the kind of truism of now going to art fairs, again, back to the big galleries, where the young, hot artists are being priced not for today, but they're being priced for 5 years' time.
Yes.
And it's kind of interesting because it sort of anticipates growth before the growth has happened. It means that you could get lucky, and you could could have something very valuable on your hands that you could turn around in less than a year. It's interesting because a collector said to me the other day, we were looking at a painting that was painted in 2023, and it was sold in the evening sale last week, and it had been bought by a guarantor. So someone had guaranteed the buying of the painting, but no one else had bid on it. And it was expensive. It was hundreds of thousands. And my collector said, "Why did no one bid on it?" And I said, "Well, look at the provenance. The painting was painted in 2023, and the person who just bought it was the fourth owner of the painting. And that is that's a trajectory that only goes into stock market crash, you name it, whatever it is, and so my biggest advice is that speculation is great. No one wants to buy works of art that go down in value. No, and it's no fun buying art that goes down in value. I don't buy art that goes down in value, but speculation to be that day trader and to be selling in a few months' time, buy as if you're going to keep it.
Yeah.
And if you change your mind, okay, but buy as if your kids are going to inherit it.
Yeah.
They don't need to. You can change your mind, but the criteria for selection: is this going to be something that we as a family are going to want to have moving forward? And is this something that I'd be proud not to burden my children with? Because that's the other thing, is that, art that you can't sell, it's really hard to know what to do with it.
Of course.
And so you have to think long term, even if you make short term decisions, if that makes sense.
Yes. With art as an investment, you sort of just touched upon it. Obviously now there's kind of this growing prominence of art even seen as an asset class.
Yeah.
What do you think of that, and why is it still so taboo? And often when I speak to collectors, oh, no, I never buy for investment. Is there an reaction? It's like, well, as you said, no one wants to buy art that's going to go down in value. So why is there this sort of taboo nature around it?
I mean, I suppose people don't want to talk about money. Art is investment. Art was always investment. And we should always think about that, and we should always celebrate that. The reason why it's important is that it drives everything else. All that commerce drives all the good stuff that happens in the art world. It also drives a lot of junk, but it does. It enables all this stuff. So we should not be even remotely apologetic for art being a commercial thing. Commercial monetary value is part of a set of criteria that help us preserve that work of art and celebrate it. I would never want the raw economics of collecting not to be part of the conversation. There's something, and that's why you have to take a kind of longer term perspective. And that's why you also have to step up and make sure that what you buy is at least an 8 out of 10, not a 6 out of 10. There's no 10 out of 10. 9 out of 10 is worth 80% more than an 8 out of 10. An 8 out of 10 is worth 20, 30, 40% more than a 6 out of 10. Yes. And a 5 out of 10, which doesn't look like the thing that doesn't, whatever, is not a bargain.
Right. I see.
So there's no such thing as a bargain in the art world, by the way. There's courage of your conviction, so you can get in there and you can buy, but there's no such thing. Oh, it's going cheap. Well, it's going cheap for a reason. We have to understand what those reasons are, and it may be that you just say, okay, it was the wrong day, it was the wrong sale, it was whatever. In which case, let's go in and buy. But buying something at the right price is also sometimes really it's a very important way to focus on the work that you're engaging with, and sometimes it's not about getting the bargain. Sometimes it's just about getting the right work. But we shouldn't underestimate that this is part of everyone's thought. You don't sit in the house thinking, oh, I'm happy it's going down in value. You don't buy a work of art thinking I'm happy it's going down in value. Now, it may go off out of focus and it may come back. You think about the trends in the art world where that's the case. I think there is an interesting new alarm bell that goes off. Is we're seeing more and more artists being cancelled, and that's a really interesting one because that can happen with some reality comes out and it's made public, and then you think, oh, that artist is cancelled, so no one's trading in that artist anymore. I'm just kind of waiting for someone to cancel Picasso because Picasso was probably cancelable on paper.
Yes.
But he's not being cancelled yet. But if he were, what would that mean? What would that
look like?
Yeah, what would it look like? And so, in terms of this idea of taboo, look, if you're a collector, by definition, you are probably you have a kind of disposable income that's able to apply to that. I do always say, that some of the most interesting collections have been developed by people who don't really have money. They've just prioritized in a different way. There's some beautiful collections that have happened with tiny budgets. I've also seen people pooling resources and sort of sharing a collection with neighbors, with with friends and so on, and spending hundreds, not thousands, on the art, but actually because they're smart and because they do their homework, actually moving forward, it ends up being kind of really interesting. The other thing is that money's always in the equation with collectors, because a perfectly good example of this is if you do something smart with the collector. Let's say you buy a painting. This has happened with collectors, with me, where you buy a painting for $10,000 and it's worth $1 million 10 years later, and we're all thrilled. Okay, we're great. We all think we're a genius. Okay, but when it's worth $1 million, and you're building a collection, and you have a work when that work was 10,000, and you have a work when it's 50,000, when it's 100,000. Is it a smart collector who also buys it at $1 million? It hurts a lot, because you say, well, the first one that I bought cost 10,000. But then you say, well, actually, but you're buying the story, and you're also buying a trajectory, and you're buying something that no one else has. Now, if you buy that one now that's $1 million, it hurts because that one cost 10,000. But now you've got a narrative that no one on the planet has got, because you've done that. And so there's a very interesting thing that when art becomes successful, one of the challenges that collectors have is for themselves to readjust to the very growth that they've been part of. So if you're collectors, in my view, are not people who just have a few paintings. Collectors are people who are collecting in the present tense.
Actively.
They're actively continuing to collect. And so you're faced with those conundrums. And the smart collectors are the ones who are still looking in those young galleries, and they are still looking at those artists that they've supported in the first place. That's the smart collection. And it's not just it's not by bringing the younger artist into your now bluish chip collection, because it's become blue chip over time, you are helping elevate that younger artist and bring them into that. And that's great collecting. That's what I love. And that takes time.
Of course. We actually discussed it a little bit with some of the collectors I've spoken to for COLLAF, who have said that they'd like to obviously include their big pieces, but they want to also bring in the emerging artists that they're supporting for exactly that reason. By showing those emerging artists, it actually increases the credentials for that artist, because they're being shown alongside
and exposure,
these established ones, and it's exposure. And also other collectors can then see, okay, this is actually a work of value by this emerging artist. I want to maybe check them out too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And for a work of art to enter into that collection, if it's a great collection, adds value.
Of course.
And that's payback. You're not just buying the work of art, but you're also giving them a context that's really potentially really really beneficial.
Yeah. I have one final question, if that's okay. What are some of the biggest misconceptions in the art world that you'd like to dispel?
Biggest misconceptions. Okay. Once upon a time, the art world was quite a closed place. That word connoisseurship, which is a word that we don't really use anymore, but it was sort of thrown around for the handful of people who were the gatekeepers and who were the custodians of knowledge and expertise that gathered around these precious objects. In the world today, where we have access to all of this data online, something very interesting has happened. That with all of that access to information, everyone thinks they're an expert. And so you could, for example, be looking at a painting that didn't sell in the auction last week and wonder why that painting didn't sell. And you could panic and you could say, well, it's over, and no one's going to buy that. That artist is finished and I've got 3 of them. What am I going to do? And what I would say in relation to that is that very often people are not looking at the bigger picture. They have loads more information than they ever had. They have access to statistics, but statistics tell you only a bit of the story. That painting that didn't sell, it might have been damaged. It might have been offered around too much. It might have had a bad history. It might be actually not a great painting. There's a million and one reasons why that painting might sell. Or it might be that it was placed behind 2 or 3 paintings that sold for loads of money, and then everybody kind of breathes a sigh of relief in the auction room and it, lost focus. That's, there's lots and lots of reasons. And so my sense is that you should always be looking at the bigger picture, and that price is not the only criterion that we should be thinking about. And we, it's about that longevity that you're sort of really hoping for. So that for me is kind of the biggest thing that I've sensed, that it's as if we've all been empowered with a bit of information, and actually it can be kind of quite deceptive. But equally, I'm kind of very grateful that I can do research, at my fingertips. But then you have to go go beyond. The other thing that I would say, I've been on both sides of the fence. I ran a gallery for 5 years, so I spent a lifetime being a buyer and 5 years being a seller. And when you're a seller, you realize also that there is a kind of fiction that's constructed in the art world that to do with scarcity, to do with access, to do with a sense of urgency. And the thing that I found myself saying again and again and again with people is, don't rise to the bait. If someone says, I do remember being given once a 10-minute reserve on a painting, and it was $1 million plus painting, but I was given 10 minutes. Oh. And I think those days have gone. But the interesting thing was that I was relatively young, the collectors were relatively young, and we kind of rose to that stress. And I kind of think if someone does that to me now, I'm much more hesitant about it. I kind of think, no, if you want me on board, let me
take a minute and think
about it. We need a little bit of time. But it's that moment, the 10-minute reserve.
Ridiculous.
It was admittedly, sort of 11 o'clock at Art Basel, but even so, and my attitude also with that, and this may be contentious, if we didn't get it, okay, there will be another one, might take time, whatever. And in relation to that, some of the best things that I've been able to buy with collectors have taken time. And one of the most amazing things that we were ever able to buy took 5 years, to find the one. It came, and by the same token, we knew instantly that it was the one. We did buy it on the spot because we knew it was the one. So my instinct is that the art world has got a lot. There's a lot vested in in having to work quickly and whatever. If you're working particularly with contemporary art, think about it. The artist is still making art, etc., etc. So if you miss something, then you know, be sure that it's for you. And if you're not sure, then it's not for you. You know, I know this is the opposite of certain collectors. I mean, one collector, one of the great collectors in the world, I would say, I once had and became a good friend afterwards as a consequence of this, was obsessed with getting the works that he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be a multi-million-dollar work, or it could be a work that was single digits. It was nothing. I mean, and we fought. We met over a £2,000 work of art, and he'd bought every other work in the show, and I bought the one work, and he was prepared to give my client a multiple because he just wanted that work.
That
and
one
I said,
work.
calm down, you don't need every work. But his way of collecting was obsessive in that way that collecting is almost a kind of sickness, you know, and it made him an amazing collector. It made him one of the greatest collectors of history in a way, but because he was obsessed with even the little things as well as the
major pieces,
the masterpieces.
Yeah,
exactly. So all of those things, but the reality is, one step at a time. It's a learning process.
Thank you so much for your time.
Oh,
pleasure. It was such a pleasure. Thank you.